Yeah, it's really great to be here, and it's also really amazing to have met up with Margarete as our careers have been parallel and twisted around each other, and really we haven't had a chance to actually conspire. So look forward to that in the coming years, I hope. Yeah, when I was invited to come here, I was thinking about how you can be optimistic at this particular moment, and how we can talk about playfulness in a way that is not seemingly shallow and glossing over real political and social issues. And my driving question is really clear. How should or can artists and gamers respond to today's environmental and political crises? So many of us in this room, perhaps all, are struggling to make a difference and see what's worth it in the face of daunting crises. And play invites us to initiate a profound shift from existing norms into something else. And that is the same power of optimism that I'm trying to hold on to in the face of these dystopian moments. And I'm trying to really go across all forms of play. So in my talk, I'm not talking about necessarily indie games or video games or board games, or I'm not thinking about genre. I'm thinking about the act of play. And in the end, I'm giving a little teaser here. I end up really thinking about embodiment in play and how the body is more and more at stake and required in our notions of play. But first, I'm going to go into a little bit of past for those historians in the room. You will like to think about Dada. You know, playing their way out, artists fled parts of Europe and ended up in Zurich during the First World War, forming the Dada movement. And on the right, Hugo Ball, a poet and Dadaist, wearing a Cubist costume at the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich in 1916, kind of starts to poke fun at uniforms, notions of representation and everything else. And so we know that Dada existed to kind of reject reason and reject logic in this kind of sense of things don't make sense. So irrationality, intuition, all of these kinds of responses become normal, embracing irrationality and chance operations. And if we look at Dada across the way, even in New York City, we have, this is Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven's. I'm not sure many of you are familiar with her work, but she was anti-art, pro-absurd, and she played her way out of a lot of social norms, especially gender norms. She would shave half of her head, shellac the other half, run around and escape the police, and generally cause havoc in Greenwich Village. And of course, in redefinitions and restudying Dada in New York, Duchamp's famous urinal is in fact believed to have been created by Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven. But that was an object, and she did do some objects, but really she used her body as a medium and as an artistic material. And her way of intervening became really performative in nature. So I'm thinking a lot about those kinds of notions as I move forward in my research. And we also see that kind of performative embodiment in going through the Surrealist movement with Leonore Finney, and also we have kind of notions of embodiment of Leonora Carrington, who actually painted this Adieu Amenhotep piece while she was in an institution from her partner Max Ernst being taken away by Nazis. And she went to this institution, and it was quite interesting because she said that she was just playing. She told her therapist she was just playing, and they didn't believe her. And of course, I think about Fluxus artists as well. So looking at a lot of different 20th century art movements, there's also Gutai, about thinking about how the body becomes central to all of these performative acts, and even sometimes dangerous to the performative acts, like thinking about the risks taken by artists such as Yoko Ono over here, which is her famous cut piece where she invites audiences to take very large sharp scissors and cut the clothing from her body. So the stakes get higher and higher in these playful, embodied approaches. I'm going to take a jump just about 10 years later, and I'm going to go to pop culture, and I'm going to think about, okay, well, that's how artists have thought about these kinds of responses, playful responses. What about gamers? And so I'm really interested in thinking about how fantasy and imaginative thinking itself can be used for liberation. And it can also be used against such ideas. Okay, so this first example here I'm going to have 2 examples on this, is the American conservative attack on role-playing in the 1970s and 1980s. So this first version of Dungeons & Dragons, I believe, came out in 1974. Yeah, 1974. And there were, it was a kind of an underground thing. I'm from Wisconsin, where Gary Gygax had the first Gen Con and the D&D. So it was a very big presence when I was growing up. And this notion that role-playing itself could cause harm, that it could cause damage, it could cause suicidal tendencies, and even demonic possession. Okay, this seems very silly, right, to us? But in fact, it was a pretty big, it was pretty wild. One of the accusers said, very credible seeming people were saying, a scholar on this was saying, very credible seeming people were saying occult ritual abuse is all around you. We've seen it and the signs are visible if you know how to look for it. So it was, fantasy itself was kind of seen as this nefarious portal for occult training, and that it was taking the lives and imaginations of young people. And in fact, in 1979, there was a suicide by James Dallas Egbert. He was discovered missing from his Michigan dorm room at Michigan State University, and the parents believed that he had died because of his use of Dungeons & Dragons. And this moral panic went on and on and on, and was even seen in comics. There were many films. You probably have seen some of these from this 1970s, 1980s. By the time it got to pop culture and Tom Hanks in around 1982, 1984, it had already been bubbling up in lawsuits, and even a news program called 60 Minutes had Gary Gygax on to dispute why this kind of idea of fantasy was being seen as dangerous. And for me, this example, I'll give you one more slide on this because it's pretty great. The intense occult training through D&D prepared Debbie to accept the invitation to enter a witch's coven. So these are contemporary comics by Jack Teachick from the time, and it's kind of and they were critical of D&D. They weren't ironic at the time. This was like supposed to be anti-D&D comics. Okay, so there's this whole this whole kind of tension around this notion, and for someone who's worked in technology all of my life, and as someone who was in the game development industry really early, very few women were working there. Very few women still are working there, but it's slightly better, I say, hoping. I have to say that this example reminds me that a lot of times when we think about women in IT and women in STEM, and there's this kind of discourse around inclusion because of technological barriers, right? Like technological barriers are the kind of policing gate of participation. We see that in a lot of research studies about global inclusion as well. But if we think about these kinds of examples, the problem is not about who is actually using technology or not, or who has access to technology. The problem is policing of the imagination itself, and who is allowed to play, and in what ways they're allowed to play. And this is an overlooked area in game studies about this notion of freedom, and when play becomes something that is for one's own self to explore. And of course, the people who caused this moral panic. You know, the young people who were struggling, who ended up with suicidal tendencies and other kinds of issues. This is not a majority of players, obviously, and those poor kids probably had nowhere else to turn. So being empathetic to thinking about, okay, who needs to play actually, and why can't we play, and who gets to police that? That is part of my concern today. And then, of course, that leads me to think of the co-option of play. So there are wars against the imagination, and then there are wars to use the imagination. My second example of turning play on its head brings us to contemporary Italian politics. As some of you might know, in 1977, leaders from Italy's far-right party and youth movement planned to change the situation involving youth. They proposed a fascist Woodstock, a 2-day back-to-nature retreat organized around the celebration of J.R.R. Tolkien's work. They called it Hobbit Camp, okay? By bringing together youth from the radical right and left, and some people called it an orgy of creative activity, organizers had hoped to spawn this kind of new tradition, new nationalism based on a shared love of Tolkien and fantasy. Even some music, some bands came out of this. This was like a big thing. And of course, Giorgia Meloni, current prime minister, attended the 1993 revival of Camp Hobbit. And she recalls that her friends were nicknamed Gandalf and Hobbit after central characters. And after her election, Meloni's sister Ariana vowed on Facebook to emulate the Hobbit Samwise Gamgee in accompanying Meloni on her quest to Mount Doom. Some of us, which is Mordor, I don't know why she said Doom. Anyway, some of us might be thinking, okay, yes, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings series stands for exactly the opposite of a fascist approach to its core tenets, respecting multiculturalism and you know, getting along with people who are creatures who are very different than you. But that is not necessarily how the story has been used. And in fact, Meloni's narrative and Meloni's party and the party that ran Camp Hobbit, which was a related party, have really said that you know, Frodo's quest is about a return to nationalism and a return to authentic European experience. Okay, so which is just an interesting and perhaps horrific twist on something many of us may love. And I bring this up, of course, in the lineage. Tolkien's imagined world led to Dungeons and Dragons. It was a very, very clear lineage. I mean, orcs, you know, like orcs do not exist. So orcs came from somewhere. Like this whole myth, this whole fantasy world really kind of bubbled up from Tolkien and moved on into these very unexpected places. So Meloni has since founded her far-right conference, Atreju, as a fantasy-themed politics and discussion meetup, very much in the mold of Camp Hobbit for youth and adults. And she named it after the boy hero in the fantasy novel Neverending Story. So these are some scenes. They're singing songs together. We've got ice skating. There's a Christmas market, and there's this whole notion of fantasy-themed politics that are intended to fix a particular way of imagining the present and the future. Atreju is now described by at least one conservative website as the biggest event in European conservatism. And in 2018, Steve Bannon from the United States participated, and in 2023, Rishi Sunak, Viktor Orban, and Elon Musk were in attendance. So it's easy to imagine a future in which, for the European right, you know, all roads lead to Mordor. You know, it even goes so far as to bring this myth outside of just political spheres into the public. You know, the Lord of the Rings has been, Meloni funded this big exhibition on Tolkien. It was a 250,000 euro exhibition in the National Gallery, which included this kind of spectacle and maps and things like that, and she actually met political leaders there. I'll show you a picture of that, which is just fascinating. But if we think about it, the sagas of Middle-earth align with the logic of contemporary right-wing populism a bit. For example, there are good hobbits and elves who battle with evil orcs, leaving little room for nuance. It's a zero-sum game. It's winners and losers. And it's not that hard to imagine the twist for a nationalist agenda. Maloney, she claims her favorite character is the peace-loving everyman Samwise Gamgee, just a hobbit. And she subtly compares Italy to the lost kingdom of Numenor, referencing the rallying cry of Two Towers. So she seems to view Tolkien's work as a didactic anti-globalization tale, a staunchly conservative epic, advocating for an all-out war against the modern world in defense of traditional values. And this is I don't know how to say his name, Morawicki, and Maloney meeting at the exhibition to create a common vision of Europe. Okay, so that is my, we just swam through art history and contemporary politics. Okay, so just like, let's go to some smaller artist-run examples of how we can imagine the presence. How are artists using ludic methods today? And I'm gonna bring you a couple examples. And I'm working with my co-author, Laurel Carney, on a book with MIT Press called Speculative Game Design. And so keep your eyes out for that, as we're still putting it together, but a lot of the research has really revealed some interesting tenets that I'm sharing for the first time in public with you all. So I hope that it's very interesting as a kind of reveal. Let's talk about LARPs and what a speculative LARP might look like. I mean, in some ways you could argue that all LARPs are speculative, and maybe all games are speculative because maybe they don't have one defined answer, it depends. But I'm looking at more of how games can be used to create new futures we can't yet imagine, right? So thinking about that. So I bring this example of the Treaty of Finsbury Park. It's a UK-based project, and it was primarily designed by Ruth Catlow of furtherfield.org in London. It's an artist collective that develops art and technology for eco-social change. And they created this piece in a park by asking the question, what would it be like if other species were to rise up and demand equal rights with humans? So they created this project over the course of 5 years. And they put on a series of LARP to explore how this dawning of interspecies democracy could emerge. Like, how can this actually be possible? And players role play as non-human species, including trees and grass. And they attempt to negotiate a treaty with each other and with human beings. The project's aim is to help its human players understand the specific needs, desired, and lived experience of other species, not only to increase empathy, but to more thoroughly understand how biodiversity is critical in mitigating the effects of climate change, even at a local level. What would a world with total equity between species even look like? What protections and/or resources would allow a park squirrel to live with the same amount of safety and happiness as its human neighbor? And how would those changes affect the day-to-day lives of Londoners? So imagine the ripple effect 5, 10, 15 years from now. What could actually emerge from this particular arrangement? And so while some players embody dogs, squirrels, and geese, embedded researcher Ann Light played as a specific species of grass. Something she found involved a lot of projections, saying, I have little enough idea about how a dog experiences the world, but I have a lot more of an idea about dogs than grass. Probably. However, doing her best to immerse herself resulted in some fascinating insights. So for the book, we've interviewed a lot of people playing and designing various kind of games, including LARPs, around the world, and that's still ongoing. So if you have projects that you think I need to know about, please come up and talk to me during this fascinating day together. So anyway, so she was supposed to, the species were supposed to get to a specific place. And she found that trees and grass had a hard time moving quickly because they are not really a quickly moving species. Therefore, she wound up traveling alongside other slow-moving species like stag beetles, observing their behavior. They were very nervous about being in an open meadow, she explained. So this is really beautiful because they're just ordinary people happening to be there, but they're simultaneously really identifying with this sense of this other interspecies moment of empathy. And it wasn't until people physically role-played their plants and animals that these discrepancies became obvious. No one anticipated this idea of speed being a thing, or even kind of ways of connecting being a thing. And I think that's really part of this notion I'm thinking more and more about, is this embodied play being used by the right in, fictional Mordor rallies, and also being used by the non-right to imagine possible futures that are sustainable, viable, and meaningful to all of us. When I say us, I mean beyond human. Another example that came up time and time again, and maybe some of you have heard about this one. This one's been going on for quite a while. It's a game called Just a Little Lovin', abbreviated as JAL, if you've heard about it. And it's an example of a particularly well-designed and transformative LARP that deals with highly sensitive and intense and potentially challenging themes. So it was originally played in 2011, and it's a 6-day-long game, okay, about 2 circles of friends within the gay community in a fictional 1980s New York. And players sign up to portray pre-written characters with some predetermined relationships and story beats within them. And it takes place across 3 4th of July parties, the first in 1982, then 1983, then 1984. And over the course of the LARP, many player characters will contract and possibly die of HIV/AIDS. And through their characters' personalities and relationships, and even though things have been developed for them in advance, players have no way of knowing whether they will or will not be killed. So there's a sense of very intense, strong community building. And the game received some pushback upon its announcement, including members from the LGBTQ+ community, about the appropriateness of straight players playing being gay, perhaps even more tastelessly playing HIV/AIDS. Like, what is that really a topic to discuss? But in the end, players from all walks of life have found the experience really transformative, and so it made it a very interesting example. In fact, many instances of people actually coming out in the middle of this game versus their real life, coming out as gay, because they had a community and they had a context to explore what it might be like. And so there's this really interesting idea that it was both society being reflected and what it was like, and also this kind of personal transformation. And so it has a publicly available version of its script, and it's been played numerous times around the countries around the world since 2011. And one of the main features about this game is not only is it long and intense, and there are stakes involved, but there are debrief sessions, and that makes it very interesting. They employ multiple methods of instructional scaffolding, as well as frequent opportunities for structured reflection. And so because the game takes place over these 6 days, play is broken up by workshops and debrief circles, and providing players with opportunities to change their character's direction or process their emotions. And then sometimes subject matter experts will come in and be a resource. So there's a sense of kind of a hybrid activist fiction world happening. And Janaya Kemper, another really interesting LARP designer, says, "This game to me shows design-wise exactly how you can get people to change and think." So there's interesting possibilities in hybrid forms that are just emerging, and often from the LARP community. I'll give you one more example of a game that Ruth Catlow and I worked on together, and it was called Play Your Place. And it ran from, possibly 2011 to 2015 or something like that. And it was an open artwork. It was a public engagement art project, what's called social practice. And the fundamentals consisted of community engagement and an online game building game. And so what we did is we set up, we actually created this piece of technology where you could take a picture of a drawing, and it would, if you sent it to a particular email address, it would automatically put it inside a 2D game world, like a platform game world. And you could just assign, without code, assign a behavior and kind of create this dynamic world. You can make enemies, you could avoid things, you could do various kinds of game actions very, very, very quickly. And through these drawing workshops and public game jam events, we brought together this notion of playing and drawing to create this collective world building situation. And it was all focused on discussions at a local level, like what does it mean for a neighborhood to think about changing what their world could look like? What would be the elements? And we actually ended up working with urban planners, because urban planners said we can't get this information, we don't know how to get information about people's imagination about their own space. How do you foster that kind of thing? And so when we staged these drawing workshops, we went to schools, retirement homes, book clubs, community events, shopping centers. We had staff, obviously, she and I were not doing this alone. We actually spent a good majority of our budget actually on people, to meet other people, to engage with the imagination. And the software was important, but I would argue that perhaps the conversations were even more important. So using games as a context of conversation and change rather than a end in and of itself, right? Or something that is engaged with the creation of things. And that's something that people in the game jam community have been interested in. It's like making the game jam itself as the kind of signature voice seems to be a very important part of the process, perhaps not the product, right? So, and it ended up being shown at the Tate Modern, and it was funded by the Peabody Housing Society, South Bank Center, British Arts Council, and we were able to expand our reach with this funding to be able to encourage tons of people. I would say probably 5,000 at least people were reached by this project, maybe 10. So that feels like a small number in the case of like digital game development, but it's a huge number in terms of conversations that community members are having. And we also taught about what games were, so that there was a kind of critical discourse about thinking about games that might have also rippled into the future. So that brings me to something that has come out quite a bit in our interviews, and that is almost every designer and player that we've talked to about a book, we've talked about 10, 15 interviews so far, almost every single person has brought up personal transformation. Personal transformation as the key to societal transformation. This may not be something you want to hear, because I think for a lot of us, we design games so that many people we can get the word out. We can give people an imaginative space. We can change minds and hearts. We can do all this stuff. But are we looking at the actual person, the actual player who's actually having a transformative experience? That was something that kind of surprised me in the focus from the people I've talked to, that we've talked to, about the way in which games are effective. There's more and more of a belief on the ground that games are effective at changing me. And by changing me, I change us, rather than we're going to change us. Something to think about in your own practices. Okay, art is a method. I'm just quoting Margarete. Art is a method, play is a tool, and sometimes game a vehicle. This is how we co-create ludic methods as a powerful form of intervention. And this is a small part of my talk, but just as like a teaser, because I'm thinking about futures is how do we do some of this? How do we use the Ludic method? What sub-methods do we have? And this is where I come to this idea of mechanics of speculation. What are exactly game mechanics that lead to more speculation than other kinds of game mechanics? Can we actually make a list? And through this research, we kind of have. I think everybody's familiar with this terminology. Game mechanics is a term used to describe the fundamental rules that dictate interactions within a game, shaping how players interact with each other and the game world. Mechanics are vital to games, yet in my view, we have not analyzed their pro-social potential on a granular level. They're shaped through practices and time. In tabletop role-playing space, as well as first-person shooter video games, and some core mechanics evolved from the history of simulations and war games. That's easy to see with battles, hit points, health statuses, and other tropes that are easily assimilated to military use. But what about other mechanics? There is this intractable link to war games, thinking about the history of even chess, Hefnetafel, all those battle simulations. But this seemingly intractable link to war games provides the contemporary game designer with an unexpected opportunity to break from these traditions and invent new ways of considering conflict and practicing problem solving. Wargaming expert Walter Dorn noted that so many games about conflict include epic battles and slaying enemies, yet in the real world, much of the time is spent in negotiations and the very difficult problem of peacekeeping. How can we make that exciting? The important part about game mechanics is that games are most engaging and impactful when a player is doing, what a player is doing is related conceptually or metaphorically to the play experience in such a way that the actions multiply the meaning of the mechanic in the game world. So just a taste here to explore some of these potential mechanics, and I'm just going to read them out. And I'd like to have some time for discussion because I think you might have lots of questions about these things, so I'm just going to read you a few of these. Drawing as a form of imagining and engagement. Programming, every communication is an instruction. Co-creation based on a specific truth. Embodied observation, using more of our senses. Creating a new value system and systems of exchange. Masks and costumes. Rituals, gestures, words, actions, chants. Many of our game designers talk about getting collective feedback by having some common action, some kind of gesture, inventing gestures for their worlds, singing, bonfires, the object from the future. What could it be? What future does it portend? Generational participation and generational inheritance. Each round of a game changes who is actually involved. Now you are suddenly your own children. Now you are 5 generations later. That's like this notion. And it's, you know, whether this is a mechanic or a premise is a little, but you find mechanics that actually reflect these things. So this is still somewhat fresh and being processed as we speak. Knowledge cards that can change what the player knows, spoken or written commands, by my powers you will blah, 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 which changes the direction of various games. Food and beverage, like salt becomes some kind of transformative thing, for example. Adopting personae, creating worlds with maps, invisible ink clues, not being able to speak, not being able to move, not being able to read, gesture, or only being able to speak, read, etc. Singing takes on special meaning or power. Death, as in the Just a Little Loving game. Sanity points, world clash, and drawing on the work of Augusto Boal in the Theater of the Oppressed, and thinking about also the pedagogy of the oppressed, thinking about forum theater, staging situations, embodied situations that players can actually imaginatively mold a response that they are looking for, or something like that. And the rest of the ideas come also from acting. there are lots of places that we haven't drawn from as a collective community of developers, and I would say that depending on the school and the context and the where a program ends up, generally acting techniques and drama don't necessarily combine with game development in the same kind of symbiotic way that they could. So figuring out ways that acting methods can be part of the game design process is a pretty interesting direction for us to go as a community. So at their best, games are a site, to borrow from Paulo Freire, where people educate each other through the mediation of the world. And that's something I want to keep trying to do in the designs that I am working on now. And the stakes are high. I've taken us on a tour of art, games, and history, of the speculative power of games, the demonization of and use of games, and even seemingly neutral analog play as sites for major power shifts. And at the end of the day, the policing of and simultaneous co-optation of the imagination is at stake right now. So to review some of the themes that I wanted to touch on today, just as a moment, play has been used to react to and move beyond societal woes, thinking about Dada, surrealism, Fluxus, playing towards social transformation. But play and the imagination can also be used for oppression and for non-liberatory ideologies and for aliens. 3, there is a war on empathy. This is something I didn't really touch on in the talk, but you can easily see it in political discourse, at least in the United States. One of the bumper stickers, like stickers that go on cars and stuff, for the current president's campaign, pardon my swearing, but there's a sticker that's around on American vehicles, and it says, "Fuck your feelings." And it's this idea of like, no, your feelings, we don't do feelings. We do something else. We do, shows of masculine power or whatever, guns or whatever, but we don't do feelings. So that war on empathy is a really interesting thing to observe and figure out how to move around that. Number 4, that idea of personal transformation being at the heart of social transformation. I'd love to have discussions on that. And again, as Margarete says, I don't have answers, but I have some questions. And this idea of fantasy and play, and in particular embodied play, these are powerful insight tools to help us speculate new models. So to close with you today, let's use ludic methods in an educated and embodied way to touch individuals and to reach individuals for sites of change. And I want to leave you with a challenge, and maybe by the end of the conference we can come up with some good ideas. My challenge for the symposium attendees, y'all, is this: think of one concrete thing you could do to change the world, and role play that. What would it be? One thing. If we can do that, maybe we can design bigger systems and bigger game designs that do the same. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Margarete, and thanks everybody for coming. It's a very nice seminar at a kind of difficult time. The title is The Dystopia of Play, and it's kind of meant to be. It's not meant to be quite as serious as it sounds, though it is also serious. It's up to you to figure out what's serious and what's kind of more interesting or fun, right? All right, so I'll be talking about a few things. So one thing, one thing that's kind of interesting about speaking here in Vienna is that I was recently reading my kind of family history, and I actually have a very distant ancestor who was in the Austrian Navy. Which is also, of course, like fun today, but it's one of those kind of like, it's one of those ways of thinking about that kind of times also change for good and for bad, and for bad and for good, right? All right, so this is in 5 steps. So I'll first be talking about this idea that playing is something that's kind of wonderful and free and liberating. Then I'll be talking about this kind of counter-argument that's been happening recently, which is this idea that actually game playing in some way is kind of too rational and too much about kind of optimizing, and that this in both is kind of seen as you might see even a political problem and also as a kind of aesthetical problem, that games are kind of weird as kind of art or as kind of aesthetic things because they don't really do what those things are supposed to do. And then about this kind of whole kind of question of newer designs that try to kind of reject this idea of that as a player you're meant to optimize your strategies and different kinds of games, right? Then I'll be talking about, that's the kind of question number 4 in a way, is like who's afraid of the rational, so which is, well, I'll be talking a bit about what I see as you might say a bit of a kind of political realignment about things like what does it mean to do science, what does it mean to be rational, and so on. And then finally, I'll be stopping on what I think is kind of the happy, positive, hopefully, at least marginally utopian note, right? So let's talk about the first bit first, right? So on some level, play and games are often thought about as being something that kind of fundamentally sets you free, right? So that when you're playing, you're at least not working. When you're playing, you've selected at least to be part of like some smaller world, at least for a period of time. And so then like if you play, I don't know, say in this case, say kind of Spelunky, you've chosen to engage in an activity that doesn't force you to do all the kind of things you regularly want to do, right? More sort of ideologically, sort of Bernie de Koven kind of argued for the value of play like this, right? So most people find themselves trapped by rules that they only assume to be there. And then this idea that when you play, especially the way Bernie de Koven did, that allows you to think of yourself as someone who can kind of make new rules or question the rules that are already there, right? So play in a way is a kind of practice that allows you to sort of change the world and to kind of to liberate yourself and others, right? And so this in the big picture, you can also see this in a sort of more concrete picture, right? This idea that of the child playing with their food, which children really do, I can tell you as a parent. That's of course also there is something kind of liberating about that, right? So the parents have kind of set this whole situation up. Now we're together as a family. Now you have to eat this nutritious food. It's good for you. And the child finds all these kind of other kinds of enjoyment in engaging with the food, throwing it around, even getting reaction from parents and so on. So I understand from so you might say this is what play often does. It repurposes things that are meant to be serious and then kind of makes something else out of it, sees other opportunities in it, right? In this case, you might say this is a kind of very short-term sensual experience, but still has this kind of same kind of aspect to it. And so this is also what you might say that when on this level, you might say there is a kind of connection between these kind of traditional ideas of aesthetics, so that play, the child that just plays with the food is in a way kind of disinterested or uninterested in like the nutritional value of the food and just thinks about, say, like the texture and the colors and so on, right? And so this is like this is the sort of kind of classical idea of aesthetics, that this is something about you're like very quiet and solemn as you look at the artwork in the gallery and so on. And so you might say, like, if you kind of want to sum that up a bit, you might say that the kind of the idea of play as utopia is often this idea that play might even be a natural and free state of being. It has, like, for someone like Bernie de Koven, has the kind of revolutionary potential, and that changing the rules is always better than following the rules, and that play in a way is the opposite of being oppressed, and the play is the opposite of following the rules. And so I think that's often like the positive view of play. I should say it depends a little on what language you're in. So now I'm speaking English. We talk about play and games. I know in German you have like this Über category of Spiel, right? And that's the case in much of like the southern parts of Europe, right? So it's a little different, but to talk about Spiel versus talking about play. But if we think about it like this, at least, we say that what then happens often if you play both regular games or video games is that you get something that seems to be almost kind of antithetical, right? So here I'm playing Zelda Breath of the Wild, and So there's an area which is very cold that we want to get to, and then we have to figure out, in order to get there, we have to kill these little monsters, and you have to collect this very complicated, or somewhat complicated recipe in order to get this potion, which can give you cold resistance, right? So this is, of course, often what you do when you play games and video games, is that you spend time trying to optimize your strategies, figuring out what you need to do next, and so on. And this kind of raises the kind of old suspicion about games, like once we start kind of optimizing, are we still playing, or is it actually something else? And so this actually makes kind of game playing pretty weird, right? So is it like when you actually start playing a game, are you actually doing something very different? So I talked about this idea of play or kind of aesthetics as being disinterested. Is it this actually the opposite, that suddenly, like when you actually start playing a game, you're just this kind of rational optimizer, which kind of is kind of very different from what we consider, say, art or kind of play? Because this is actually something that's kind of pretty common. Of course, there are a lot of games where like a lot of the discourse around the game is about that. So this is from League of Legends. So of course, you might say the whole community around League of Legends is built around optimizing strategy and lots of math and lots of what we call like the meta and so on. So that this is actually sort of fundamentally what you do. And so the old kind of very simple observation is to say that this is a lot like work. And often this might even include client spreadsheets, right, as kind of your regular work does. I also want to say that this is not exclusive to games like League of Legends. So I think this is the level 8041 in Candy Crush. So of course, if you play a game like this, it does actually involve a lot of kind of strategizing and optimization and even sort of kind of communal kind of problem solving. It does get actually very, 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 very difficult. And so the question is like, well, is that a problem? Well, so there's been a few books lately about this kind of issue. So Christopher Paul has this kind of argument. It's a bit more nuanced, but what he kind of says is, as play is altered, as players shift from open, relatively unstructured interactions into an instrumentalized, scripted joint search for the optimal, right? So for him, or like the kind of overall argument in his book, Optimizing Play, is that once you get into this too much, then you're kind of losing something communal, right? You're also losing a kind of freedom that we originally talked about with play. It actually becomes, you might say, to some extent the opposite, right? It just becomes very, very kind of rationalized and instrumentalized. Another example is Braxton Suderman's recent Against Flow, which has a bit of a kind of parallel argument that the psychological state of flow can bracket the external world and turn away from the causes of personal and social ills. It's a bit what kind of Mary talked about, like this question in a way, like if you become too focused on the game, does that actually mean you stop caring about like the larger world in many different ways, right? You see something similar. Some designers make similar arguments. So Tale of Tales has this argument that they say, if we create a virtual world, we don't want people to ascend to that systematic level and game the system. We want them to stay in that world with all its problems and all its ambiguity, because that's what we find interesting, right? So that definitely, I think this is kind of just a kind of very strong current, this kind of skepticism against both kind of playing as kind of systems and playing as something where you like have to optimize, have to kind of hone your skills in order to get better, and so on. There's also this kind of larger kind of cultural kind of argument around that. So if you ever read The Master of Go, so one of the at least one kind of interpretation of that book is to say that Go has traditionally in the book been seen as something that's tied to kind of ritual and respect for elders and so on. And here comes a new player who only cares about optimizing. And that kind of destroys the whole kind of culture around Go. But also that, of course, this is also about, you say, like the beauty of Japan and the Orient kind of flees in the face of this kind of optimization, right? And so optimization, in a way, here is a kind of a threat to kind of dignity and to beauty and kind of tradition. So similarly, like, so that there's a more specific kind of video game argument from Paolo Perricini. So Paolo Perricini who does these kind of interesting games under the header of kind of Molle Industria. So his argument is that video games for him are very closely tied to, say, like the military and other kind of oppressive kind of regimes. And then also that in a way, so the way I was phrasing it in a kind of positive way just before, saying that perhaps video games are a kind of a way of looking at the beauty of systems or something like this, right? He sees it more as the aesthetic form of rationalization, which is bad in this case, right? So that this is just that video games kind of they replicate something kind of terrible in society at large, right? So you might kind of if you're kind of keeping score, it should be says this is also kind of question for the Frankfurt School outside the scope of this talk, right? But you can sum up these kind of criticisms of player optimizations, right? That one is that with players optimize, they forget the world of the game. When players optimize, they forget emotions, they become kind of rational. There's this kind of sub-criticism, which is in a way also the problem why it's often, at least traditionally, been hard to get games into galleries, right? That players seem to behave too differently than you're expecting gallery goers to behave, right? So that has just been a kind of very concrete kind of problem in a way. That's also perhaps kind of larger, kind of this more kind of argument that rationality is in a way kind of inauthentic, right? That it takes us away from our authentic being, ignores tradition and beauty, and this was kind of Christopher Paul's argument that it kind of makes players kind of ignore community. And in a way, like finally, like the Paolo Pedicini argument that kind of optimization in a way is a kind of oppressive thinking in and of itself, right? All right, so I think this is a kind of criticism that's been going on for a while. I'll just like point to kind of a few ways people have been trying to kind of work around it. And I think perhaps the strongest or the most...
the gulls do not... I've noticed that.
What was called kind of walking simulators, that whole kind of subgenre with games like kind of Dear Esther, to me was perhaps the most kind of clear way of kind of rejecting kind of optimization, right? Because these are games where you don't really need to do a lot to play them. And that's, of course, by design, right? These are much more about kind of experiencing a narrative or just experiencing a world or things like that. And so it's not really about kind of becoming better at playing the game or anything like that. And so I think that's, to me, it's like, that's kind of, I think, one of the big, you might say, design responses to this kind of question of kind of optimizing play. Another example from that time is the game Proteus, which is a little different. It's a little more, it's a lot less linear than kind of Dear Esther was, but has a bit of the same. It was also called a kind of walking simulator in that it's just more about kind of exploring a world and not so much about achieving any one thing. You can actually do something, but that's not how it's kind of promoted. All right, so this in a way is a kind of an old discussion. So I think when I started, I think this is actually true. So when you live to be a certain age, you feel things shift. And so when I started at the university, I do think it was the case that most people in the humanities had a pretty strong skepticism towards kind of science, right? And I think what's been kind of interesting the last few years is that you have this thing called sorting. I don't know if you know this concept. It's this idea that you have certain things that at some periods of time kind of cut across all kind of political and identity spectrums. And then at other times they become kind of sorted, right? So they become assigned to, say, one end of the political spectrum. So you have something like natural food, which I think used to have a very specific inflection politically, and now that it's actually becoming kind of much more kind of spread out. You have something like science, which I think used to be considered kind of representing like the status quo, and this now seems to be becoming again like sorted, so that there's this kind of skepticism towards science and universities and so on become associated with one kind of part of the political spectrum, and a positivity towards kind of science and math and empirical studies becomes somewhat more associated with another part of the political spectrum. And so I think that's also, I think, to me, what's kind of interesting here is that something like the idea of rationality, like when Paolo Perticini talks about it, I think it's to him it's somewhat obvious that it represents a certain kind of politics. And I do think we're in a situation where that's a bit up for grabs. So these things seem to be kind of moving around a bit, and we don't know where it will end. It probably won't end, right? But still. I do think deep down that whatever we may think that current political problems are not necessarily due to too much rationality. That's my personal take on it. But I think it's just worth noting that these things actually do kind of change, and actually pretty rapidly. Just within like 10 years, you have these kind of very big sortings of like the associations between a specific idea and other ideas, right? And so this is just an example, like one that moves in one direction, another that moves in another direction, one that kind of stands still. Yeah, so that's the idea of sorting. It's also something that happens, say, geographically or in terms of cultural consumption and so on. All right, so in a way, just to say just where the bottom line, in a way, for me is that I think it's very easy to get hung up on saying that there's one particular way of thinking, one particular way of playing, one particular way of kind of culture that belongs to someone and not to us, or to them and not to us. And so I like the Emma Goldman quote. It's not exactly what she says in her autobiography. It's close enough, right? To say, if I can't dance, I won't join your revolution, right? That I think it's true that it's too easy to get hung up on that, saying that there's certain things you cannot do right now, say in the current political climate or what have you. Both because it would be terribly sad not to be able to dance or play video games or things like that, and also because if your political movement kind of excludes these things, then once your political aims are achieved, it's not going to be great, because you're going to have a hard time putting them back, right? So what I think in a way is that what's kind of interesting, I think that I really like games like Dear Esther and other kind of walking simulators, but I do think to me what's kind of slightly more interesting in when people try to actually think about what, say, optimization, how that can actually play a role in a pretty large variety of kind of games. So I took the game Gris as an example. So in a way, it is a platform game. It has this kind of wonderful graphics. It does have a bit of this kind of personal, emotional, therapeutic story. But it is also something of a game that you actually have to work a bit to be able to kind of complete, right? At the same time as being a game that doesn't punish you very much. So when you fail, you usually can just kind of spend a little time walking back and continue kind of where you were. And to me, that's interesting. So you do get some of this, what I think of the kind of contemplative aspect of trying to optimize what you're doing, just without being kind of punished very harshly for it. Another example is the game called Stillstand, which is basically about having an existential crisis in your 20s, but then it's one of those games where you're stuck a lot of the time, and that's actually kind of the point, right? The point is both as a player and the main character are trying to kind of fix their lives, right? And you often can't do this, and things aren't really moving the way you hope they do, but that's actually kind of a point. So like this kind of failed optimization is actually something that kind of expresses an idea, a way of being. Another example would be something like kind of unpacking, so which a lot of unpacking is basically, if you haven't played it, is basically you unpack the moving boxes of a character through different decades. And while you do that, of course, you're reflecting both on the character's life and on your own life and so on. And so you might say that this sort of very banal thing of optimizing your space, or optimizing where to put all your belongings, actually becomes a kind of space for reflection about all sorts of things, right? And then I think finally, as a kind of final example, I'd say take something like Stardew Valley, the whole kind of genre of games where you have to say, I think what Brie Code talks, tend and befriend games, like you have your garden, you have to figure out how to grow your things. That actually is kind of pretty much based on kind of optimizing kind of various aspects of kind of plants and animals and so on. But that's, I think, a recognition that there is a kind of space for quiet, everyday kind of enjoyment in these kind of things. So to sum that up, so I just want to say that I think yeah, you see the point, right? So the big argument is that in a way, play is often seen as something that's just kind of very free, outside kind of optimization and rationality. Then once we get to actually playing games, we see this actually kind of occurs a lot. You often spend a lot of time optimizing your strategies and all these kind of things. And I think there's this whole kind of discourse about how that is somehow problematic. And I'm just pointing to that there is a kind of class of games where they just kind of try to do away with it in entirety, right? But that in a way, I think what's often interesting is these games that try to kind of include things like optimization as sort of part of like the message, if you will, or part of the core activity or part of the meaning of the game. And so then kind of to sum that up, I think, so the problem of optimization, I think there's a few different kind of answers to it. So one is that we probably need to, I quoted Kant. We shouldn't be all hung up on Kant, right? There are newer ways of thinking about these things. But also say that optimization can be a communal thing, also in a good sense, right? It can also be a topic in itself. It can be a device that can express ideas. But I do think that I think it's true in a way that games and play can be the kind of aesthetic form of rational thought, right? So in a way, what games do often is they put thinking inside the frame, right? So that is what you're looking at when you're playing a game. You're looking at how you're thinking and how you could think and how you're not thinking, right? And so I do feel that it can be a little too simple to just be kind of critical of games that include rationality and optimization, and also that these kind of the kind of alignments do seem to be kind of changing. So I think it's kind of important. It's important not to be too quick to dismiss areas and ways of doing. I do think that, like my own field of game studies, in a way, I think people ended being very harsh on each other for a long period of time because we felt we were under siege. And so then you end up doing this thing where you look for signs for like the thing you don't want. And I think that is usually kind of problematic. So yeah, don't abandon areas or fields or methods. It's a bit like, I think there was also discourse about like, how games are terrible, how game culture is terrible, and so on. I think it's better to kind of stay there and try to kind of engage, right? But as a kind of final, just saying that I do think the kind of newness of playing games is still one of the most radical, interesting things is still that there is a lot of kind of rational optimization in playing games, which is super weird because that's not how we used to think about culture or about kind of things that are expressive. So that's the talk. So hopefully it wasn't kind of too dystopian. I do think that I think this is actually Brian Sutton Smith's point that play can offer hope, both kind of concretely for yourself, and hopefully also in a kind of communal and kind of broader sense. Thank you.
It's always delightful to be talking at an art school because it's a bit of a homecoming. I am very much an art school kid myself. I went to Centre St. Martin's back in London, and then I did my master's at Goldsmiths, also in London, in Art and Politics department, where I wrote my thesis about video games and politics. But anyways, it was at Goldsmiths. There's a Stuart Hall building. In fact, he was the late Stuart Hall actually taught there for a while. That's where, being Eastern European, I always gamed. I played like Doom and Quake all my life, but I always hid it from my like kind of cool arty activisty friends back in London. And it was after reading more of Stuart Hall's work, who really centers pop culture as a huge space, huge political space that is up for grabs at all times, and then finding out that video games are bigger than music and industry, that music and film industries combined, that I decided, okay, hang on a second, so it's this biggest cultural space there is, and you know, GTA is making, I don't know, 6 times more money than like Taylor Swift or whatever, and like 30 times more than Charlie XCX, you know, so, and yet it is not really shown in our society and culture and in our politics. So I started writing a weekly blog basically on medium.com after my MA thesis, which was all about video games and politics. And that very quickly, within a few months, started me getting, because I think my point of view was quite unique in the sense that it was materialist rather than like I would call liberal. It was always a materialist critique of the video games industry. Straight away, I know I was kind of invited to write for a lot of nice places and do university talks, and I was lucky enough to be nominated for some stuff. Started doing a Twitter-based show, in fact, that then I archived on YouTube called Left Left Up. I do wonder if it'd be funny, you know, if a show was called Left Left Up, but then was like right wing or something. It's actually, it would be funny if, I don't know, it's like a luring in kind of thing. And I would, you know, play video games, talk politics, drink some tinnies or whatever. But, and I was also organizing world's first anti-fascist esports club back in London as well, which was a delightful time. But honestly, the rubber hit the road, and where I started feeling like, things, you know, that I'm actually, I guess, doing something. Well, I mean, back in London, I was doing kind of full-time activism, but it wasn't games involved. Was back in 2018, I suppose, at the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, the Game Workers Unite movement was born, which was the unionization movement for the games industry. When I was very privileged to be a part of the creation of the British branch, which was like the second games industry trade union in the world at the time. So yeah, we were like organizing kind of, obviously organizing the union, but I was like also organizing parties at the same time, and yeah, also was heading the communications department for Game Workers Unite International. But so yeah, I felt like all of my worlds collided, which is politics and video games, and we were really doing solid work. Turns out that doing a lot of voluntary work is not necessarily bringing a lot of bills, so I did get a job at the Chinese Room, which is infamous for me being the makers of Dear Esther. So I guess now, I didn't know actually that we're gonna be talking about this, and allow me to do a bit of a defense of it. Well, first of all, you know, it was like a mod for Half-Life 2, and I think even its creator, Dan Pinchbeck, is very open about the fact that, you know, he put it on, well, him and his co-creator, Jessica Curry, they've just put it on Steam and didn't think much of it. And it was Steam, in fact, that planted it on their front page, and that's how it got, you know, whatever it was, the hundreds of thousands or millions of downloads, which makes me think that much of what we assume is, you know, like, or what we decide as the academic discourse is actually very much planted by the industry itself, in a sense, like we wouldn't be having a conversation about our walking simulators if it wasn't actually for Steam deciding a lot of these fashions for us. And then this term walking simulator was actually put on the arrestor by the kind of reactionary right wing, who at the time were like, what is this game, you know, without mechanics and so on, right? And I don't know, I just think it's a beautiful storytelling device. Whether it's efficient or not is another question. I have questions around video games generally about that, but I mean, it was very, you know, revolutionary at the time, and yeah, I'd be worried about us kind of prescribing kind of gamer rhetoric too much on actually, yeah, beautiful pieces of art. So anyway, so I work for the Chinese Room, who also made Machine for Pigs. Obviously, everybody's gone to the Rapture. Still Is the Deep just released back in June, and we got like 8 BAFTA nominations, which is amazing. So I feel very lucky. And the next one is Bloodlines 2, which we're all, you know, highly anticipating, but obviously a bit scared as well. And I was lucky enough to teach at this university. But we're here for this guy, of course, yes. So I put all of my ramblings together, and I wrote Everything to Play for How Video Games Are Changing the World. And I was very lucky that it was the first book about this for Verso Books, the publisher, the biggest kind of, I guess, progressive publisher in the world. And it really, they did put it, I guess, in the right places, because it was picked as one of the Guardian's best books of 2024, and it's being translated to 7 languages, which is fabulous. And I think the next year for me will be traveling the world with all of it. Yeah, and again, I suppose the way that I structured it, the gimmick of it all is a little, I structured it as, I think there's like a timer thingy on this. Oh no, oh well, I'll figure it out. as like a video game. So my introduction is a main menu, my history chapters, the tutorial. Then I have levels 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the final boss. I'm not gonna go into level 1. I actually wanted to get the story / narrative part of a video game out of the way very early on, because it is my view that that is something that is actually put in a very vertical way by the game writer or game designer to their audience. And it's in my view the most simplistic way of engaging with a video game. And so I go through all of these, like, of course, violence, misogyny, bad, all of these things. But I also think of what would be a more clever way of addressing these topics, because it is not my view that violence is somehow bad. I actually think, we would hear Viennese actionists, right? They do violence incredibly, right? And also, as a huge Quake lover myself, I didn't necessarily turn out entirely violent. So I just don't think that that's an interesting topic necessarily. As well as, with sexism in video games, the kind of heroes that were then pushed for us to be the women in games, which is like the Lara Crofts of the world, the kind of, I don't know, combat ladies with daddy issues that go like very, very posh and go around the world like destroying places. Doesn't seem like very good feminism either. So anyway, so this chapter goes through the theme of video game and also what would a really truly radical response to it would be, and not necessarily kind of the opposite of that. The communities chapter, and if I were to be talking about communities, we would be, well, in this particular talk, I would talk about all the different ways that solidarity, reciprocal altruism, and self-organization happens in video games. And these are just some of the gifts of beautiful, beautiful stories of gamers coming together and making incredible, like, pieces of politics, I would argue, and class war and stuff like that. But today, again, all of these, again, I have fabulous stories about all of these. But today's topic is, Pokemon Go has always had so much love for this game, and now we all heard that Niantic sold it to like Saudi Arabian prince, right? So that's a bit of a shame. The politics of that are a bit rough. But today I want to focus on this particular bit, the efficacy, because that's something that I think we've discussed a lot through this conference already thus far, is the fact exactly what Mary was saying, is that an efficacy of a video game, political efficacy of a video game, is not at all measured. And it is so true that in games academia, there's just not been at all many research projects thinking, okay, so how do we change somebody's mind, right? And I think if you are making political piece of art, presumably that's your mission, right? And I heard that ITU in Copenhagen are looking at funding something like that, particularly with green games. I have my own reservations, but anyways, at least the beginnings of it are happening. And I figured a good way of trying to start thinking about measuring efficacy, political efficacy, would be looking at how the fine art did it. So Artificial Health by Claire Bishop was my Bible when writing the book, in particular this chapter, because she, I think, thinks, well, first of all, she writes about participatory fine art, but I read, this incredible book, and at all times I could have just put, political art or political video games instead of participatory art, and it would have worked just the same. So certainly, I can just say that this is, certainly was my Bible when talking about the following. And I was also thinking that there's a lot of text in my slides, but being a writer, I guess this is how kind of I think these days, is mostly in text. So I will be doing a fair bit of reading, and I hope that's okay. So Claire Bishop beautifully, I think, encapsulates the problem that we're kind of dealing with, which is that socially collaborative practices are all perceived to be equally important artistic gestures of resistance. There can be no failed, unsuccessful, unresolved, or boring works of participatory art. You can insert political video game, because all are equally essential to the task of repairing the social bond. While sympathetic to the latter ambition, she would argue that it is also crucial to discuss, analyze, and compare this work critically as art, since this is the institutional field in which it is endorsed and disseminated, even while the category of art remains a persistent exclusion in debates about such projects. So, precisely, then kind of, the next slide also, one of the slides also underpins this, that just because something is, I don't know, sold to us as with empathy or you know, community-driven or participatory or political progressive, it doesn't make it good art, right? And what could it be to actually make good art in this? So, or you know, or it doesn't necessarily, you know, change anybody's minds. At the end of the day, what it does mostly is kind of preach the converted, right? So how do we make it that that's not the case, or how do we attempt to even think about this? And this was one of those moments that clicked. I think the year must have been 2015. I was in a squat in London, since I lived in squats for about 8 years. And the library next door, Central St. Martin's, was, you know, a place where I would just, you know, go spend all the time and pick out books. And I picked out this amazing little, basically like a zine, and it had this beautiful quote by Marijam Did that just made me think, yeah, just blew my mind. And I never really thought of political art. Basically, there is a before and after. And since then, I just think about this quote. So, Marijam Did, in an essay, this is going to be really funny, notes on art, institutions, and their presumed criticality, neatly exposes the futility of many contemporary socially aware cultural practices. And I think, again, because you are hopefully practitioners of the future, it's just something I really would beg you to think about. She crafts a simple yet effective analogy between the act of telling a joke and the declarations inherent in much of political art. If before telling a joke you say, you know, this is going to be really funny, then the listener will most probably not find it funny at all. Something about the initial declaration diffuses the humor, the surprise factor is removed, and the listener can prepare in advance for the punchline. And I think this analogy extends to critical or political games, proclaiming that one's work is profoundly critical can instantly strip away that intended effect. In fact, a certain ambiguity about the artist's intentions empowers a more potent critique, as with funnier jokes. And to kind of, okay, now move on to examples, right? We've all seen, I don't know, art like this that basically tells you very, you know, loudly, I am making critical political art that is meant to make, you know, the world a better place. Let's say, so to give some examples, Agnes Dean in 1982, she gets a piece of land close to where the Twin Towers were built, I think at the similar time, and she plants a bunch of wheat there. And then that wheat gets distributed around the world. I mean, all she did realistically, and I mean, it's seen as this like epic participatory art piece. All she did really is to basically, with art, gentrified New York's estate. Ai Weiwei always does this, you know, the sort of, oh, look how this is critique against, I guess, Western capitalism and China at the same time. You know, it's basic stuff, and Olafur Eliasson does it all the time, and I write very extensively in my book about all that. How many of you went to 2022 Venice Biennale, perhaps? One, two. Oh, awesome, quite a few. I guess it's not too far. Did you go to the Finland's pavilion? What did you think about it? Because, yeah, I found it very, very upsetting. So, yeah, Pilvi Takala goes, you know, they are a middle-class artist, white artist, and goes to pretend to be a security guard at a supermarket, a mall, and overhears one of their colleagues, who's like, you know, a working-class migrant, tell, I guess, a bit of a sexist remark. Pivli, well, and also, so Pivli, an artist, becomes like a security guard in that particular space. Then promptly, legit in real life, actually informs the management and then creates a sort of like a affinity group where they all talk about how like awful and sexist this worker was, which is, you know, I agree that one should be challenging these sort of remarks, you know, again, that, but whether it should be in this way, and then basically capitalize from it, and you know, parachute in a community, make a piece of art out of it, and just get out. I just found, you know, again, being of their class, I found it was really, really uncomfortable to watch. But you know, good political art. I have, and again, of course, it being in Venice Biennale, for people already that, for the most part, will have open hearts. You know, whose minds were changed by seeing these pieces of art? I don't think anybody's. And I think with their same kind of economy happens in video games. that there is indeed, in fact, an entire economy of awards and festivals like Games Beyond Entertainment and Games for Impact, and entire festivals that are telling their audiences and are selling games that are they self-defining as somehow progressive and political. Now, whether they do the thing of changing anybody's mind, it remains a question. And this is probably the most controversial, is that Paper Please is actually a big villain in my book. This is a game where I'm sure many of you know what it is, but the point being, I suppose, is that rather than the message of a particular game or piece of art, or in particular game, because I think it's much harder to find it accidentally. Usually you will go and try and buy it because you heard about it, right? So the key is actually marketing more than anything else, more than the narrative, and even often more than the mechanics. Is that you hear that that's a game that's probably for your tribe, and you will end up buying it. I worry again that these, and we can, Alba, at least they actually planted some trees, I think, as part of the sales for Apple as well. Apple, one of the most polluting companies, but whatever. Let's Get Water was incredibly expensive and for no good reason, and I just think, and it was released like with MTV, but again, you could have probably printed, I don't know, 15,000 books, or anyways. So there's just, it's all of these examples. And so one should never mistake good intentions for strong art. Political commitment is a beginning, not an end, as generous ideas can sometimes lead to reactionary artwork, contradicting those original intentions. Art has to start changing the world through questioning its own conditions of production and diffusion. And I will be talking about that production part at the end of the talk. That's sort of my final boss, because that's, I sort of believe, is where it's at. But okay, as I say, I compare a lot to fine art, and what would be good examples? I don't end up just saying, all is bad. There are some pieces that I do think are, if they don't necessarily change somebody's mind, which I think some of them do, but they are very, very innovative in terms of their logistics, in terms of how they're marketed, or in terms of their in fact, optimization, in the sense of just how cheap it is to make the message. So many of you will probably know the practice of Santiago Sierra, who employs working class people for negligible amount of money and puts them in a gallery to do menial tasks. And he's often attacked for, just borrowing labor's time and not paying them more. But most often the participants say that they feel like they've been seen by these kind of liberal elites that go to galleries more in this kind of gallery setting than usually. So he actually experiences very serious attacks. Santiago Sierra does, but in the end, he gives more attention to the populations that service all of us, more than the people that kind of go to the galleries and then attack Santiago Sierra at the same time. Hans Hake creates investigative journalism, essentially. He made this piece about slumlords of New York City, and just organized a party in a gallery and invited a bunch of journalists and the creme de la creme of New York's art scene, and just put this investigative journalism on the gallery walls. So that was an inventive way of people, instead of, just thinking of mode of distribution, right? So perhaps the idea is not the theme even, or not even the contents necessarily, but the fact that you capture a particular audience and make sure that they certainly engage with your piece of art. So modes of distribution and modes of marketing, I think, is actually where most innovative things can happen. Chris Burden, I mentioned, he was it was an anti-war protest in a White Cube gallery, in a very hip White Cube gallery in Los Angeles. He asked for a friend to shoot him in his arm. Again, just a very, optimized and a very, I think, efficient way of making a point. Video games generally, I think, suffer from the fact that this just takes so much time to make them and so much labor. One could ask whether a certain, another medium would do as good of a message. Hank Wills Thomas's and Reisinger's work is encountered on the streets. So again, let's think about how could digital games be encountered? You know, what could be the Banksy of video games? You know, how could you do that? Mark Wallinger took anti-war protesters' entire, I guess, camp after he was evicted from the Parliament Square and put it in Tate Modern. So, okay, so how do you, again, take a protest, a real live protest, it was an anti-Iraq war protest, and add it into a space where it's unexpected, right? Where people will have to engage with it, whether they want it or not. And Tania Bruguera, in order to make a point against, well, I suppose, against art elites' indulgence, all talk about politics, but also indulgence in its dark sides, as part of just a performance piece of art on a white platter, or like on a silver platter, she was just giving out cocaine to everybody in the audience, like, and let's think about what would illegal acts in gaming would look like, right? It's the kind of thing that Steam will not allow, right? You cannot do illegal things on Steam. What would be a way to break out of the essentially 2 or 3 shops that we have for video games? So yeah, again, just thinking that we are actually very, very constrained within our hardware, within obviously all the publishing deals, and certainly even within the stores where we are encountering these games. So how could we challenge that? And now some of the video games I think do amazing, kind of action. How to explain this? The previous slide showed art pieces that are very lauded and celebrated and adored by the arts. You know, they're in the Venice Biennale. They're in the kind of curator circuits. They are inexpensive. You know, they're all worth a bunch as pieces of art and so on. Where video games excel is in that kind of institutional critique that fine art can't help but fail at, because it all gets kind of regurgitated in its own industry. Whereas if you are going to make a piece of art in the video games that will actually critique industry, you will get banned. You will not get your game sold. So again, is there a radical space perhaps within that? So yeah, you know, of course, Mole Industria's Phone Story, which is essentially a Foxconn factory simulator where iPhones are made, that was banned. I Am Rich is an awesome little app that costs $999.99 and was banned within days from Apple Store because there's nothing there. You just buy the app and you have the app and then you open it. Well, actually, I don't know what the insides are because I didn't buy it. But there's nothing there. There's nothing to the app. It's just essentially it's a way of showing off that you have money, right? Again, institutional critique. Carrot Pop Send Me to Heaven, another game that was sadly banned because it's an international high score game, and in order to get at the top of the high score, you have to throw your phone as high as possible. Needless to say, games stores are not too thrilled about their phones being broken and shattered, so they banned that game too. I mean, even something as innocent as La Petite Morte, which is, I suppose, a sex education game with relatively, I guess, you know, not stylized graphics were banned and was banned, and it's the kind of thing that, again, in the arts I think would be celebrated. There was a game about Columbine that was actually very, very deep and fascinating, that destroyed the game maker's life and also got him banned from the industry entirely at the same year as Gus Van Sant made a film about the Columbine, well, kind of Columbine-inspired film, and he got like Palme d'Or, you know. So again, different mediums, it's interesting how they are perceived. The Uber game, what's interesting about it, okay, you know, it's not a spoiler to say that it's essentially a Uber simulator, and then you are the driver, and at the end of the day, you actually, after all of your taxes, there's nothing left, and you didn't even earn that much. But so it's not particularly interesting, except where it's placed. You can only access the game via the Financial Times website, which to me is interesting because it's not via The Guardian, right? If it was like a center-left publication, sure, yeah, of course, Uber drivers have a bad time. No, it's released via a center-right publication. So once again, you know, there's so much more space to encounter something and attempt to actually change somebody's mind. And lose is just cool. I mean, it's I don't think it actually got banned. I think you can still download it, but I think it's just badass. It's just really an alien shooting game. But I think every 5th alien that you shoot, one of the files in your computer just gets randomly deleted, and it could actually be something part of your like motherboard, you know. So that will completely destroy your computer. And again, I think that this kind of institutional critique of about the hardware itself that is kind of radical within video games, whereas in the arts it can sometimes lose its radicality. So yeah, these are just sort of the kind of games that kind of interest me in terms of their efficacy, but of course there are more. Yeah, but this is, you know, so I really, again, being an art school kid, efficacy chapter was sort of my favorite one, but the final boss and kind of the level 4, the one that is the most difficult to talk about, it has to be the motor production, right? I mean, I don't know, I just keep thinking how games academia sometimes can feel like a bit of a satellite industry to the industry that actually enables this entire thing. Like, it's actually fascinating how little we talked about the industry today generally. I mean, but that's kind of how the sausage is made, and it's made in a very, very nasty way. And I think until we challenge that, like, kind of what are we talking about? So of course I'm very informed by my 4 daddies, as I call them, you know, Hall, Benjamin, Adorno, Bourdieu, and I think Walter Benjamin's author as producer was also a key essay for me to internalize in terms of thinking, again, if I am making art, you know, like if the making of it is poisonous to somebody somewhere, then you know, like how can I allow that? How can it really feel like anything positive about anything? And we know that our brushes and our canvas and our clay is covered in the blood, sweat, and tears of the global south, right? There's no 2 ways about it. This, probably a few women in Congo and, you know, and babies dead or something, right? And I don't know, this and that, probably a few jumps of a Foxconn factory. And I don't know, I just feel like other games, other art industries like just don't suffer from it as much. Sure, to an extent, but just not as deeply and entirely and completely as games do. And I just really think that until we really put the pressure up to eliminate this original sin, as I call it, yeah, I don't know if there's much to talk about, because at the end of the day, all of our sexy, cool jobs that you guys are gonna get in the games industry, and I have, is really a result of like a bunch of misery elsewhere. And I don't know, I just feel like until that gets resolved, I feel this fundamental guilt at all times. And so the element that I have on the book is this, you know, do you see a sunrise or a sunset? And for me, it really depends on the day. Sometimes, you know, I actually see some beautiful piece of art in games or an amazing community that's done something incredible within games, and I just think, damn, it's pretty awesome. We should, like I can't wait to see the next big thing then, or playing Indica or whatever. We just played it the other day, and it just was entirely mind blown. And of course, you know, I don't know, just running through a Quake level or whatever. But most of the time, I really just see an industry that is consolidating, that is essentially dependent on 6 companies: Epic, Apple, Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo, and I guess I'm forgetting one. But anyways, that's Valve, of course. So and the creativity within all that is just getting worse. So yeah, so really, I really implore that we all, bit by bit, actually would be creating a sunrise rather than a sunset of an industry that's getting nastier every year. And I do have solutions, because of course, you know, it would be a bit of a. I don't think it would be too cool to just leave without the solution slide. Support unionization, support efficacy research, archive and document instances of proper organizing in games, craft networks of game curators ambitious about political demands. We should be having, I think, a kind of a certification system for consoles. Because I do really believe that this original sin is the core of all. We must refrain from diagnosing the problems in gaming in terms of their aesthetics, and instead fight for emancipation and improvement in the same way we would fight for the betterment of any industry. The spectacle does not colonize everything. Boundless creativity is exuded by masses of people who live under the existing systems of domination. The action of play, of enjoying artistic creations, has always been a part of that. And the mission before us is to uncover the methods and mechanisms for unshackling games from their current modes of production, freeing from the necessity to compensate for bad deeds. And yes, the stakes are high. Indeed, it is still anyone's game. Thank you very much.
All right, so let's hope it loads. I asked to speak after Marijam because I knew that she's gonna. Maybe like this. I asked to speak after Marijam because I knew she's gonna talk about efficacy, and I thought that would be would provide great framing for my talk, because I'm gonna talk about a few games I've made in the past that tackle some political issues quite directly, and I thought that she's going to give me all of the intellectual tools already to present my loser argument for my pathetic political games that are made with Unity and other such popular game engines and run on blood-soaked hardware. But I do share a lot of her views, and I think it's good to look very critically about games when we try to tackle politics. Let's see if I have my speaker notes. Maybe I'll have them. At one point I'll have them when it loads. Right.
You need some internet?
No, it's okay. Let's do it from memory. All right. I want to start. I'll do it from memory. I want to start with telling you about a game I didn't make, but that inspired this talk. So there's a pretty famous American adventure game called Kentucky Route Zero, and before it came out, or when it came out, they released a demo to promote the game. And the demo was its own thing. It was a small, separate game that is actually an art exhibition for a fictional artist that's a character in the main game. And that demo is called Limits and Demonstrations. And I'm particularly inspired by this one virtual piece of artwork that you see in here. You can download the demo, it's free online. And that piece of art, let's see if I remember how it is called without my notes. It's something like Namjoon Paik redubbed in the style of Edward Packer. That's the name of the piece. And it is allegedly made in the early 90s. And the piece is, what you do in the game basically is you play this, I think the woman on the right, and you approach this thing with your friends, and there's tapes taped on the wall, and you are allegedly running a tape recorder head on those tapes, and then a dialogue comes up, like a video game dialogue, and you start reading what is supposedly the audio that you hear on those tapes. And this audio is a story of exploring some cave, and this audio basically tells you of a few friends exploring a cave, maybe it's you, and then the choices you make in the dialogue are supposedly aligning to where the characters are moving the tape recorder head on those tapes on the wall. Now, if you know your art history, you know that this piece actually exists. It's a pretty famous piece of physical artwork by an artist called Namjoon Paik. He's famous to have been the father of video art, but he also made a lot of art with other types of technology in the, I think, 60s and 70s, but he lived until the 2000s, I think. And this work that exists in real life, I saw it at the Tate a few years ago, which is called random access, is inspired by early computers, but of course he does it with a tape recorder, and it's in the real world you listen to music. There's two speakers, and he took some piece of music on a cassette, and he cut it and put it on the wall, and it's like this Dadaist, but also premature interactive art. But the name of the piece inside this gallery is in the style of Edward Packard, which I think is a reference to the real-life Edward Packard, who in the 70s was the father of modern, not all, but modern choose-your-own-adventure games. There's literature in the ergodic style before Edward Packard, but this is like the first very popular one. And the dialogue of exploring a cave is actually a reference to the Colossal Cave Adventure, which is the first modern digital adventure game when you make choices and go to different places. And what I love about this piece is that they bring in a bunch of real pieces from art history and recombine it inside a video game. But they do more than that. They recontextualize it. They say all of those, especially Edward Packard, who worked in literature, and Namjoon Paik, who worked in like the, let's say, normal art world, traditional art world, Fluxus or Dadaist movement, they are actually predecessors of what we know as adventure games, as a genre of games that is now very, very popular. And by bringing them into a modern adventure game, they kind of like reread the past as bringing us into somewhere else. I read a book by Slavoj Žižek a few years ago, in 2023, I think he released a book called Too Late to Awaken, where one of his claims is that instead of doing a lot of speculation on the future, one of the best political projects is to reread the past, speculate on the past, particularly look at the past, what we're told to not do, which is historical relativism, and stuff like that. We should look at the past with modern lenses and trying to learn from it and seek, revolutionary potential in the past to prove that, there's potency, that it's not just imagination. I take this, given not political, overt political work, as an inspiration, because I am thinking a lot about how art can involve itself in real histories and pull reality into it. I also chose this title because I think political art is very limited. And it's often limited to a form of demonstration. So it's a bit of a wordplay. I'm going to talk about a few works I've done now. Because I also don't have my notes, please tell me if I'm running over time, because I don't have my notes exactly. So please just mark me. And I want to be very, very careful with how much I boast about my works as in terms of like doing politics. If you take one thing from my talk, is that we should be very, very humble with how much we believe our art can change the world. There is a difference between talking about politics, which is fine, and doing politics, right? And whenever I think about efficacy, because I think whenever we make political art, we need to think, are we teaching ourselves something, or are we trying to pretend we're doing something? And is our time and money not better spent organizing? If you're an anarchist, do a direct action. If you're a communist, build a movement, or whatever, right? But maybe, if you want to do politics, maybe don't do art, which is, I think, something to think about. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about 3 games, including Gerda, and they represent 3 approaches that I've taken throughout the years. And I'm going to be very critical towards my own games and games of, I also collaborated with people. I want you to know that I love all of them. If I wouldn't bring them if I don't love them. And I do love them. So this is daddy looking at his children and talking lovingly about their failures. But also I'm saying I am going to judge them now mostly on their politics. But there are, of course, other facets that exceed this judgment, like beauty, right? But in the context of what I'll be talking about today, I care more for, reach, their cost effectiveness. Do they enact material change? I also care a little about whether they inform a discussion, whether they taught me something while making them. And I care very little about, how precisely correct they are. Okay, I start with Wolfenstash, which is the earliest example I'm bringing, and also my favorite of the examples here. So first, let's describe the conditions that led to its production. This was totally indie, not like indie games like that are still part of the economy. This was made with no money, and it was a free game that made no money. And the genre, because it's good to think through it, is, well, it's obviously a shooter. So what is this about? In 2017, I think in October, Wolfenstein, The New Colossus, which is the second game in the rebooted Wolfenstein games made by Machine Games in Sweden and published by the American publisher Bethesda, comes out. It's a very cool action game where you play this, super hench American Jewish guy who just murders Nazis in an alternative history where the Nazis kind of won the war and they have like crazy space technology. And two things were kind of like circulating around its release. The more famous one is that the German version of the game that released in Germany, and I actually don't know if it was the same here in Austria, I don't think so, is censored in a very weird way. They removed all of the overt Nazi symbolism from the game. All of the swastikas were replaced with like funny triangles. Any mention of Jews was replaced by mention of like traitors or Polacks. And Hitler is not called Hitler. It's just like also he's like the ruler or something, and they shaved his mustache. Now I don't know if you have ever worked in the in the game industry, especially in AAA games. This is expensive. It would be expensive for a small game. For a AAA game, it's cutscenes. It's render. It's replacing models. It's replacing voice acting. Doing all that with version control because you still are marketing the game in a different way in the rest of the world. What about updates? It's very expensive and very weird. The reason behind it is probably a piece of legislation in Germany that is sometimes interpreted as censoring Nazi symbols. Yes, I'm saying probably because nobody ever admitted exactly why they did it. But I'm saying also interpreted because, in fact, it is not, no cop is going to come and arrest you if you do this kind of thing. You could just get sued, like in a civil suit. And also, you're exempt if you're doing it for science, for education, or for art. I guess Bethesda doesn't believe that games are out. Less known, because it's a smaller territory, is that in Israel, they didn't sell the game at all. Again, Bethesda never admitted why they chose to never sell the Wolfenstein games in Israel. But when approached by journalists, they would just be like, oh, no, that's complicated. And the assumption, again, is that they're worried that it will somehow upset Jews. Very, very weird assumption, because you play a Jew that kills Nazis. but it just shows the kind of like, conservatism of big publishers. I'm an Israeli, and I was living in Israel at the time, and when it came out, I immediately thought, well, I know what to do about that. And with two friends, over a few days, we made what we called a free, unofficial DLC, where it's a 2-minute game, it's a shooter. We said that we can't play the game because we can't buy it, so we had to imagine how Wolfenstein might be from the older games. You walk into a room. There's a big. You get a full explanation of what's going on and the context for this game and the marketing context. And you walk into a room. There's a big portrait of Hitler. He has a mustache. The Ride of the Valkyries start playing. You pull out some like an AK type gun with a Star of David for crosshairs, and then Hitler's mustache jumps out of the painting, and you start blasting the mustache, and you fight a bunch of mustaches that come from all around, and there's big swastikas on the wall, and then you win, and that's the game. The shooting, we made sure it's very satisfying. It feels good. I like it because I like that it was fast, cheap, and free. I think when you're trying to participate in politics, being efficient with your production is good. Same with the delivery. We put it on itch, which is a platform that's very easy to distribute on. And very importantly, I spent as much time designing this very, very short game as I spent pushing it with emails to every publication that I could think of, and it did get a lot of media around it. Because it was fast, it was very close to the release of Wolfenstein 2, which was a big release. The headlines about the mustache was still running around when we released it. Because it was free, and because I pushed it really, really hard, I think, and I agree with Marijam, marketing is a big deal of making political games. We also utilize our identity. We didn't posit ourselves as like indie designers or game designers in the industry. We said it's from gamers in Israel to gamers in Germany. It was our gift to our German gamer friends. So it was a community. People call these things now folk games, right? If it's free, it's a folk game. So it was a community effort and was quick, and I think it's why it's got a lot of headlines, and I'm not going to claim that it's hard to measure impact, but it was part of a discourse that led eventually to amendments in the German law, and we know that the letter of the law allowed this thing to exist before, but it's not just the letter, it's also the spirit of the law. And because I personally think that what Bethesda did is really reprehensible, it's doing this weird historical relativism, it's giving mystical power to symbols, which I don't like. I am happy for how we participated in the discourse and how we led to a small change. The Bluff Collection is a game collection I commissioned as the curator of Princeton Festival. That was it was a digital arts and culture festival in Israel. It doesn't exist anymore, but I used to be part of it for many years as the games curator. And with the Bluff Collection, that was for the 2018 edition of the festival, I commissioned 3 games under the topic of fakes and fabrications, with the intent of trying to tackle political subjects. Eventually, we selected 3 groups from South Africa, Germany, and from Israel. I'm going to tell you very quickly what those games are, and then I'll talk about the experience of working with those creators to make those games. Hidden Files was a game by a German creator that dealt with a real story of the German secret services basically trying to quickly censor and delete government files pertaining to a neo-Nazi terrorist group that acted in the late 90s and early 2000s and that killed a lot of people in Germany. When the story blew out on the media a few years later, the Secret Service denied access and deleted files so they're never found, and took some information and made it that wasn't secret, made it secret just to hide I guess what people speculate is their knowledge about this group and the fact that they didn't do anything to stop it. And in this game, you basically play a Secret Service agent trying to get rid of information and censor information before journalists get to it. So you are basically complicit in, you're kind of playing the part of the government agency. In Welcome to Stanistan, which is a game by a group of Israeli designers, you play a government media person in charge of the government's Instagram page in a fictional Eastern European country, trying to create a presentable image of the country that is maybe a little too polished and getting likes on social media. And in the third dimension, a game by two creators from South Africa, you basically are experiencing something like a educational CD-ROM, the type that was very, very popular in the 90s and early 2000s, in an alternate history where South Africa has had some fictional scientific developments that allowed them to produce large quantities of gold, and thus, through intense riches, get over the international pressures against apartheid and maintain apartheid through the 90s and 2000s. And this is the kind of educational software that basically mirrors a real thing that happened in apartheid South Africa, which is they had several separate education systems, for I think 4, for different populations, and whites and blacks and coloreds, that's how they called them, had different educational systems that were meant to compartmentalize them and maybe push blacks, for example, towards working class jobs while giving a broader education to white people. The reason I chose those titles is because they interest me also as an Israeli. They touch on some subjects that are very, very important for political discourse also in Israel. Israel has, for different reasons, several education systems. Israel famously was very busy since the early 2000s in branding campaigns that backfired and led to what we know now as the boycott movement that started from the Israeli government trying to brand Israel in cool and techie ways. So that was a part of my interest in those works. When I was working with those creators, I was trying to maintain this efficiency. Of course, it was a commission, we paid them, but I also severely limited the scope of the games that we commissioned, insisted on them being very small. And one of the reasons is that, and actually we didn't accept good applications because they were too big and fancy, because we were really, really focused on like this has to be small and sharp and not reproduce some of the exploitative production methods that are very prevalent in video games, even by mistake. I can say that reflecting on those games now, I still think they're great. Please download them from the internet, they're free. But there's different powers to some of them. I think that Hidden Files is probably the most potent politically because it's the most direct. It just deals directly, very directly in a real political reality with real, mostly real names, talking about the victims, talking about a real thing, and you feel the weight of current events when you do it. And it doesn't matter that it's quite shallow, the metaphor is not very, very sophisticated. On the other hand, Welcome to Stanistan is also quite a simple, shallow metaphor and play presentation, but because it does this movement where it talks about an undescript fake country with a mishmash, very beautiful, very nicely produced mishmash of visual representations that you can't pin on any specific culture, what you get is something that doesn't feel as sharp. And the last thing I think is the third dimension will maybe endure the most. It will be the game that will stay the most relevant maybe 10 years from now because of its depth. So depth has a place, and the depth of a game can make it more interesting and lead to longevity. It can make you think a little more, even if it's not as sharp as Hidden Files. All right. How am I on time? Okay. Let's talk about Gerda. So, Gerda Flaming Winter is a game I designed and was the lead on narrative, but it had its own writers and a bigger team. It was made by 15 or 20 people with a studio called Bird Island and released in 2022. It differs in its production. It's a commercial game. It's also publisher-backed. So it's not just us who are stakeholders and our salaries depend on it. It had a big publisher. And that, I think, changes a lot about what we can and cannot say and how we say it. It's an RPG, story-based, there's no combat, right? So, but it's still a role-playing game with stats and mechanics and dice rolls. It deals with a specific history, and why it doesn't tell a real story, it's very, very research-based, based on a lot of both family histories. Actually, Gerda, the hero, is inspired by my boss's grandmother, and a lot of other histories of Nazi-era Denmark under the Nazi occupation. And the first thing I can say about the game in comparison to the other projects is that it includes a lot more compromises. Not on production, it's an actual big-ass game with graphics and music, and we took a few years to make it, and it was funded. But you can't be, I think, as sharp when you're making a game for so long, when your livelihood depends on it. And most of all, actually, the mundane situation of having many people involved. Even if we were bold for a commercial game, it is, I think, very bold in its topics and presentation. But just the fact that there's so many people involved creatively means that you have to share a lot of things between each other throughout a long production, and it rounds some of those edges, some of those sharp edges that you want to have sometimes when you're making a political statement. But I can say nice things about it because I do love it. I think we were very focused on talking about life under occupation, which is, I think, a story that exceeds, of course, the specific historical situation that we talked about. Specifically, we really wanted to tell a story that is a civilian story, an unheroic story. If we mention, World War II and games about the Nazis, we usually get stuff like Wolfenstein, which means you pick up a gun and you stab Nazis in the neck, which is cool, but we felt like this area is covered, and they have our back, in machine games, and we'd like to do something else. So we really focused about how can we gamify in an interesting way the civilian angle which and with it tell a story that's not about being a hero. It's not about solving things completely. So in the game, some of you played, some of you didn't. Just so you know, that you play a woman who is a young woman living in a small town on the German border in Denmark during the occupation, kind of managing to keep her head low and slide through those years until disaster strikes. Her husband gets arrested, and she's trying to release him from prison before something bad happens, before they send him to the camps or something like that. And it's a lot about dealing with the different stakeholders in town, trying to get them on your side. What we try to convey with it is the pressures of life under occupation, the unfairness of it. And we're doing it through gaming mechanics, like RPG mechanics. In role-playing games, you have dice rolls, which are sometimes unfair and can get you results that you don't want. In role-playing games, you have factions. That's a very popular thing in role-playing games, the alignment. And we balance the game so that you can't satisfy everybody. There's the Danes and the Germans. This picture is from the beginning of the game. Later you will have more factions, like the resistance and the occupation. We also made it a point to separate national factions from the warring factions. We made it a point that not all Danes were aligned with the resistance. Not all Germans were aligned with the Wehrmacht. And we try to play on this very, very tense, complex, multidimensional space and use role-playing mechanics to convey it. We also looked for the places where these tensions connect to both politics today and the different wars and occupations that are still ongoing, and to universal experiences of gamers. Specifically, we thought about the gamer archetype of the completionist that wants to get everything right and solve everything and optimize, if we're kind of looking back at other talks we had today. But we balance the game specifically so that you can't, so that there's always a choice. It both is nice for entertainment gaming to allow for, replayability and trying to get it and see other facets of the game in the second round, and also conveys the feeling that, especially when you're living under such conditions, you don't get to have it all. You always have to make very, very hard choices. If I can say one nice thing about the game politically, I think that we got a lot of very, very lovely reactions from players from around the world, especially from players in European countries, where Europe has gone through a lot of wars, even in the last few generations. And many, many European players wrote to us that they also come from regions that change a lot of hands throughout the years. They also come from regions where there's a lot of international tension that is even, just like Gerda, who is half German, half Danish. It is even part of people's own families. And it was at least quite resonant with the lived experiences of a lot of our players. Okay, so this is a summary. Thank you. I think it's okay for art to follow politics. It's fine, either as a witness to political shifts, or as a judge even, to make some judgment. I think that if you want to make art that tries to participate in politics, you gotta go fast. That's I think it's one of the biggest conditions, and a lot of other things follow. It's okay not to go fast. It's okay not to participate in politics, but you should curb your political expectations and also how you talk about your art in a political way. And if you're doing propaganda, it's okay for propaganda to be shallow, because propaganda is measured in efficacy, not in depth. But if you're not doing propaganda, then you have to go deep. And by going deep, I mean being actually interested. Actually interested meaning not having perfect solutions that you know already when you approach a political issue. In the case of Gerda, for example, that was a political game, but as far as you can from propaganda, we tried, for example, to only think of gameplay situations that we ourselves could not have a precise moral judgment about. We didn't know what we would do in Gerda's shoes. And if we wrote a gameplay moment or a scene where we felt like, oh, I know exactly what I would have done, or